Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world behind closed doors, behind brocade curtains and red lacquer screens, where whispers carry more weight than laws, and silence can be as seductive as touch. You're standing at the edge of the Forbidden City, not just the name of a palace, but a whole atmosphere air heavy with sandalwood and secrets. Lanterns swing gently in the midnight breeze. You can hear the faint rustle of embroidered silk robes. See the glint of moonlight off jade ornaments nestled in impossibly intricate hairdos. You are not one of the emperors, nor one of the 1,000 concubines locked inside this gilded cage of luxury. No, tonight you walk in the soft, measured footsteps of someone stranger. Someone castrated in boyhood, dressed in shadows and whispers, who moves like smoke through power, love, and politics. The eunuch. And if that word gives you pause, good. Because what you're about to learn may challenge everything you thought you knew about gender, desire, and intimacy in imperial China. You probably won't survive this place, not unless you're very quiet, very clever, and very good at pretending not to exist. That's the first thing you feel, as the carved doors close behind you and the outside world disappears like a snuffed flame. Your body is still intact, but something in you already begins to vanish. This is not your kingdom, and yet somehow you'll become essential to its rhythm, indispensable, even before you settle in too deeply. Though, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. There's something comforting about knowing we're all lying down under the same stars. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You enter through the Meridian Gate, the tallest and most ornate entry to the Forbidden City, and immediately you notice how quiet it is, unnaturally so. No shouting, no footsteps, not even a cough. It's as if the entire imperial court breathes in unison and doesn't dare exhale too loudly. The stone paths glisten with the memory of rain, and every echo feels rehearsed. You're led to the outer court, where male officials once bustled and bowed and scribbled records. But that's not where your story takes place tonight. You're drawn toward the inner court, the secluded harem of the palace, where over 3,000 women lived not as prisoners exactly, but not as free people either. Every one of them hand-picked to compete for the emperor's affection. And behind each silken curtain, 1,000 unsaid things. And between all these lives threading them together, like stitches in a garment too lavish to move in, were the eunuchs. They managed everything: meals, clothing, secret letters, lovers' gifts, punishments, and sometimes, just sometimes, the emperor's private affairs. It wasn't just logistics, it was choreography. They knew who was ovulating. They knew which concubine had smiled too long at which official. They knew what incense covered up which kind of night. In short, they knew what love looked like, even when it was forbidden, desperate, or dressed in ceremonial detachment. But becoming a eunuch wasn't a promotion. It was more like a gamble wrapped in pain. Castration was brutal, usually performed without anesthesia in filthy conditions, sometimes with a blunt knife, other times with a bamboo razor. The entire organ was removed. Yes, all of it, and the wound packed with herbs and prayer. You had to insert a stick to keep the urethra from closing as it healed. If you didn't urinate within 3 days, you died. Simple. The survival rate wasn't great. But if you made it, you were now one of the few people allowed into the heart of power. You were safe from sexual scandal, or so the theory went. In practice, that's where things got complicated. Imagine standing at the emperor's side during a romantic festival, watching him compose a poem for a woman he's never touched, and then being tasked to deliver that poem. You're the messenger, the mirror, the quiet extension of his desire. Maybe she giggles when you recite it. Maybe her eyes linger a bit too long on yours instead. You're supposed to be invisible. Remember, but sometimes invisibility makes people bold. You don't exist, so she can say things to you she'd never say to a whole man. Sometimes that power tastes like longing. Sometimes it tastes like danger. One recorded case from the Ming Dynasty involves a eunuch named Wei Zhongxian, who rose to such influence that he could determine which concubines the emperor saw and when. That kind of access gave him control over not just romantic dynamics, but political succession. Who bore the next heir whose family gained power? All of it hung on whispered suggestions and discreet scheduling, the kind that eunuchs mastered over lifetimes of watching everyone else reach for what they could never touch. And yet sex didn't vanish for eunuchs. It just changed shape. Some turned to sensuality as performance. They used perfume, poetry, song. There are records of eunuchs who wrote erotic verse for the palace women, or who helped them secretly communicate with lovers on the outside. One eunuch reportedly served as a ghostwriter for romantic letters between an empress and her tutor. He knew how to mimic her tone, her rhythm, even the way her sentences trailed off when she was pretending not to be in love. Modern historians still argue whether some eunuchs engaged in sexual relationships of their own. The evidence is murky. Some records suggest that they developed deep emotional bonds with palace women, or with each other, in a culture obsessed with restraint. Maybe that was its own kind of eroticism, feeling everything while doing nothing. One 18th century poem, attributed to a concubine, laments her only companion being a eunuch. He holds my secrets like water holds moonlight trembling. Silent, ungraspable. And you? Wandering through these marble halls in your mind, start to realize how strange this space is. It's thick with sensuality, and yet sterile, beautiful, but aching. Like a love letter written in calligraphy no one knows how to read anymore. You pass a quiet pond where lotus flowers bloom just out of reach. You hear the clink of porcelain teacups. Somewhere, a concubine is singing a lullaby for a baby that might belong to the emperor, or to no one. And you realize that in this city of 9,000 rooms, intimacy isn't private, it's managed, curated, even weaponized. And at the center of it all is a man who is not fully man, trusted with everything the emperor holds dear, precisely because he's been robbed of the one thing people believe makes a man dangerous. Still awake. That's okay. We've just dipped our toes into this incense-swirled history. By the end of tonight, you'll have walked through heartbreak, rumors, politics, perfumes, and a few seductive mysteries that historians still bicker over in very polite academic journals. Don't worry. There's no quiz. Only the soft hush of forgotten stories gently unfolding, one sigh at a time. The first thing you notice about castration, if you're the unfortunate boy about to undergo it, is not the knife, but the silence. The adults don't explain it. They don't look you in the eye. They don't say it's for glory, or power, or even survival. They just take your hand and lead you down a long corridor where incense burns thicker than air, and a brass basin gleams too brightly under the torchlight. You're maybe 8 or 9, maybe younger. You don't understand what's about to happen, but everyone's whispering like you've already died. In ancient China, The practice of castration wasn't simply a punishment, it was a career path, a gamble that, if you survived, might earn you the right to serve in the imperial palace, a path into the most intimate corners of history. For many, it was their only shot at upward mobility. Some were poor boys sold by desperate families. Others were criminals offered castration instead of execution. Either way, their bodies were handed over to the state, and they would never belong to themselves again. The operation was performed in secret chambers, sometimes by old eunuchs who had long ago become numb to the screaming. The testicles and penis were removed entirely, and the wound was cauterized or packed with herbal paste. A hollow reed was inserted into the urethra to prevent the flesh from sealing shut during healing. And this is not the kind of pain you forget. It rewrites the body's entire understanding of itself. Survivors were left with lifelong issues: difficulty urinating, chronic infections, scar tissue, and sometimes phantom sensations. And yet, the promise of what came after was so powerful, families still chose it. So you're lying there, trembling, trying not to cry, not from pain yet, but from the weight of what you don't know. The old eunuch looks at you like you're already a ghost. You bite your tongue and taste blood. And then the world goes silent. Those who survived this ordeal became part of a very specific class of imperial servants stripped of masculinity, but granted access to places no man was allowed. They entered the palace with papers, uniforms, and a thick silence stitched into their mouths. Their job: everything and nothing. They carried messages, arranged schedules, sniffed out gossip, supervised the meals, the baths, the clothing of royal women. Their job was to be ever present and utterly unthreatening. But history suggests it was rarely that simple. Over time, the court eunuchs became more than just background characters. Some became power brokers, kingmakers, and intimate confidants. They were always watching, always listening, and they learned early on that information was more valuable than gold. Still, they were never fully accepted. For all their access, eunuchs lived on the knife's edge of ridicule and reverence. They were mocked in street plays, accused of witchcraft, and blamed for everything from natural disasters to the collapse of dynasties. But inside the palace walls, they were indispensable. One of the more curious tales comes from the Tang Dynasty, involving a eunuch named Gao Lishi, who served under Emperor Xuanzong. Xuanzong was deeply infatuated with his beloved consort, Yang Guifei, one of the four beauties of ancient China, famed for her delicate features and legendary sway over court affairs. Gao Lishi, despite his eunuch status, became her intermediary, her protector, and some say her emotional confidant. He managed her schedule, carried the emperor's handwritten verses to her, and even advised her on how to respond. This wasn't just logistics. It was choreography. A courtly ballet of desire with Gao Lishi as the director no one dared to acknowledge. Historians still debate whether Gao had feelings for Yang beyond duty. There's no explicit evidence, but his loyalty to her was unmatched. When the emperor was forced to execute Yang to appease a rebellious army, it was Gao Lishi who helped her bathe one last time and prepared her for death. That kind of tenderness doesn't come from mere protocol, and it makes you wonder how many other eunuchs carried unspoken devotions with them. How many love stories ended before they could begin, stifled beneath protocol and robes. But not every story ends in tragedy. Some eunuchs discovered creative ways to maneuver through their strange roles, because while they lacked certain physical features, they still had minds, hearts, and desires. In the Qing Dynasty, One eunuch named Li Lianying rose to immense power, serving Empress Dowager Tixi. His influence was so vast that he controlled appointments, issued decrees, and allegedly arranged the romantic liaisons of the Empress herself. Some suggest he even selected which consorts would bear royal children, managing the emperor's reproductive life with the calm detachment of a wedding planner. And yet, even Li was the subject of ridicule in folk songs and underground satire. Power never erased his otherness. Fringe stories speak of eunuchs who developed intimate emotional bonds with the women of the harem. Whether platonic or quietly romantic, these relationships were often the only form of closeness allowed in such a rigid world. Concubines, many taken from their homes as teenagers and forbidden to leave the palace, found comfort in the steady, gentle companionship of eunuchs who understood what it meant to be trapped in gold. There's a preserved love poem from a 16th century concubine that scholars believe was written for a eunuch servant. It reads, "You braid my hair and laugh at my dreams. I dream you have hands not just for braiding. I wake and laugh back." Modern scholars aren't sure how literal it is. Maybe it's just metaphor, or maybe it's a record of a secret too tender to name. Either way, it's a glimpse into a different kind of intimacy, one that doesn't rely on physicality, but thrives on trust, shared isolation, and the kind of love that survives in the cracks of palace stone. One of the strangest quirks of this system was the ritual of urine tests. Concubines were regularly checked for signs of illicit sexual activity, and eunuchs considered incorruptible were often assigned to manage this deeply invasive process. They were trained to detect subtle shifts in scent, in temperament, in posture. Sometimes it was just perfume out of place. Sometimes a smile that lasted half a second too long. You become a kind of emotional bloodhound, attuned to the subtlest energies. And in this role, eunuchs learned more about courtly love, desire, and betrayal than perhaps anyone else. They saw it all, heard the sobs behind closed doors, the whispered apologies, the forbidden trysts played out in shadow. They bore witness to 1,000 unspoken romances and never got to write their own. So here you are, standing by a carved red pillar as the moonlight spills through the lattice windows, thinking about how love and power always seem to tangle together. The eunuch in the hallway, face calm and eyes unreadable, might know exactly who's falling in love tonight, and exactly how dangerous that is. And even as you drift into that thought, you hear the faint clatter of a jade hairpin dropping somewhere behind a curtain, followed by silence. Always, always silence. There's a certain elegance to secrets when they're dressed in silk. You find yourself moving deeper into the palace's quiet machinery, where love is managed not by poets or princes, but by men who no longer qualify as men, at least not in the eyes of the Confucian Code. Yet somehow, they are the ones who choreograph romance with the precision of a court musician tuning a lute before dawn. You pause near a side corridor where moonlight cuts across the floor like a blade, and see a eunuch kneeling beside a red lacquer box. He opens it gently, and inside lies not treasure, but a folded letter sealed in beeswax, perfumed with osmanthus, and tied with a silken cord, the color of plum wine. This is not just correspondence. This is bedroom diplomacy. You're watching the ancient machinery of imperial courtship unfold, and it all flows through hands that are both trusted and forgotten. Eunuchs, with their status as neutered beings, were considered safe couriers, safe to enter the harem, safe to speak with concubines unsupervised, safe to carry romantic notes between chambers without igniting scandal. The reality, however, was far more charged. Because when you are the middleman in a triangle of desire and hierarchy, it's hard not to absorb a little heat. One famous story comes from the court of Emperor Yongle in the early 15th century. He was deeply enamored with a lower-ranking consort named Mei, because her status wasn't high enough to warrant nightly visits. Yongle often sent her gifts, poems, and hand-carved figurines through his trusted eunuch, Cheng Fu. Cheng was not merely a messenger. He composed music to accompany the poems, selected the scents to perfume each gift, and even advised Mei on how to present herself during surprise evening visits. He became, in effect, the third point in their emotional triangle, ghostwriting flirtation, softening harsh words and soothing insecurities. He understood both of them better than they understood each other. And, as some suspected, he may have started slipping his own feelings into the emperor's words. Historians still argue whether Cheng Fu and Mei developed any kind of bond that strayed beyond propriety. Official records are silent, but personal diaries found in Cheng's quarters mention a voice like summer rain and eyes that mourned the moon itself. Whether that was admiration or something more, we may never know. What we do know is that eunuchs walked a tightrope. Too affectionate, and they risked being accused of overstepping. Too cold, and they failed in their duties of service and care. They had to be just warm enough to earn trust, but never so warm as to burn. And so the role of eunuchs as couriers of passion became a strange form of intimacy, all its own, disembodied, yet deeply entangled. You move past a carved screen into a tea room, where faint traces of rosebud and jasmine hang in the air. The concubines are absent, but their presence lingers in the delicate arrangement of cushions and embroidered slippers. On the low table lies a fan with calligraphy ink, still wet 4 characters that mean, "Longing eats the days." It's unsigned, a practice sheet, or a message that never found its intended reader. You begin to understand the strange emotional ecosystem these eunuchs inhabited. They carried secrets like courtiers, carried swords, always concealed, always dangerous. And yet, they were rarely given the dignity of authorship. They could transmit passion, observe it, sometimes even orchestrate it but not claim it, which makes you wonder, did that make them more honest? Or just more patient? In another corner of the palace, a very different scene plays out. A concubine is preparing for a visit from the emperor. She sits before a polished bronze mirror as 2 maids comb her hair and powder her neck. But the person giving orders is not a lady-in-waiting. It's a eunuch named Qian. He selects the robe sea green silk with a crane motif, adjusts the lighting, and even recommends the angle at which she should bow when the emperor enters. He knows that too much deference looks insincere. Too little, and it might be taken as arrogance. He's seen women rise from obscurity to become favorites, only to be banished the next week for a poorly timed cough. So he prepares her like a strategist, sending a general into battle. And yes, battle is the right word, because in this palace, every interaction is a contest for affection, for attention, for survival. Eunuchs like Qian had an almost intuitive understanding of the emperor's moods. They could tell by the way he tilted his wine cup whether he wanted laughter or obedience, whether he sought comfort or distraction. In some ways, they became translators not just of language, but of emotional code. And this translation didn't end with the emperor. They did the same for concubines, soothing egos, coaching performances, and sometimes advising them on how to stir the emperor's desire without stepping on anyone else's silken toes. One eunuch even advised a new concubine to laugh like you've never cried, a phrase that somehow captured both the desperation and grace required to thrive in that golden cage. And yet, for all this emotional fluency, the eunuchs themselves remained untouched. Or at least, they were supposed to. But every rule has its soft underbelly. There are whispers of eunuchs who fell in love not with concubines, necessarily, but with the idea of being seen, being remembered. Some became poets, others painted. A few carved miniature sculptures of faces they could never touch. And once in a while, love did visit them, quietly, illegally. One such story hovers around a figure known only as Little Peach, a eunuch who served in the southern palace during the late Ming Dynasty. He was known for his grace, his delicate handwriting, and his astonishing memory. He could recall every concubine's birthday, perfume preference, and favorite tea blend. One day, he found himself repeatedly delivering messages between two concubines who, it turned out, were writing to each other under the guise of correspondence with the emperor. Their affair was quiet, coded, and intensely poetic. And Little Peach, far from condemning it, began to leave small notes of encouragement in the margined short poems, weather reports, even pressed flowers. Whether he did this out of empathy, or as a participant in some unspoken emotional menage, no one can say. But when the affair was discovered, the two women were exiled. Little Peach was reassigned. He disappeared from records a few years later. His name survives only in a footnote of a palace inventory list. Little Peach's inkstone, chipped at the edge. You think about that chipped stone, the residue of a life that spent its days helping others reach for affection, while holding its own heart in silence. And even now, you feel something settle in your chest like mist on a still pond. It's the understanding that love, in these walls, was never about freedom. It was about choreography, strategy, sometimes sabotage, but always under the watchful eye of someone who knew how to fold longing into linen and perfume into letters. And as you watch the last sliver of moonlight retreat across the polished floor, you wonder not who was in love, but who was watching, who was carrying the candle, who held the envelope, trembling slightly, before slipping it beneath a silk-draped door. If you listen closely tonight, closer than comfort allows, you'll hear something strange behind the tapestry of the Forbidden City. Not the soft shuffle of embroidered slippers or the hushed clink of porcelain lids. No, deeper than that. You'll hear breathing. Two sets. One is the slow, steady rhythm of a concubine pretending to sleep. The other is quicker, shallower, caught somewhere between longing and terror. A eunuch, just outside the curtain, waiting, not by accident, not by command, but by choice. And now you can't look away, because this moment is not supposed to happen. Eunuchs do not fall in love. That's the rule. That's the myth. That's the lie everyone needs to keep the whole palace from unraveling. But what happens when someone without a future dares to want something more than duty? You've wandered far from the main court now, past the hall of mental cultivation, past the imperial kitchen with its clattering bronze woks and sweet-smelling smoke. You're deep in the residential wing, where concubines live not in luxury, but in long, quiet waiting. And here, in this labyrinth of longing, stories start to change shape. One tale survives from the late Ming Dynasty, told in a whisper by one of the laundry women, passed down like a bedtime rumor for the sleepless. It's the story of a eunuch named Ren and a concubine named Xiu. She was barely 16, chosen for her beauty, her high cheekbones, and the way her voice trembled like silk caught in wind. He was 23, older than most new eunuchs, and quiet in that way that made people forget to dismiss him. Their first conversation wasn't romantic. It was logistical. She'd dropped her hairpin during morning prayers. He returned it without a word. But when their fingers brushed just for a moment, something shifted. From that day on, Ren was assigned to her wing. Coincidence, or clever maneuvering by a concubine who understood how power moved in shadows? We'll never know. What we do know is that their daily exchanges grew longer. He'd arrange her books just so. She'd ask his opinion on poetry, pretending to be indifferent to the answer. But soon, she began leaving him little notes, haiku-style fragments about rain and mirrors and memory. He never replied in writing, but once, he left a sprig of plum blossom on her inkstone, which she pressed into her journal without a word. One morning, she confessed she hadn't dreamed in weeks. He didn't respond, but the next day, she found a painted dream charm tucked beneath her pillow, a charm only eunuchs knew how to make, woven from red thread and incense ash. Historians still argue whether eunuchs were capable of love in the traditional sense. Some say no without testosterone, without reproductive organs. What could they possibly feel beyond loyalty or admiration? Others, however, draw attention to the records diaries, poetry, court gossip that speak of intense emotional connections, subtle rituals of affection, and quiet griefs that look suspiciously like heartbreak. Perhaps it wasn't physical intimacy they craved, but the kind of closeness forbidden to everyone in the palace. After all, concubines were not permitted to speak openly, to choose their lovers, to mourn their loneliness. Eunuchs weren't even allowed to mourn. They simply served, and in serving, they sometimes loved. Ren and Xiu's story ended the way all forbidden stories end. Not with a bang, but a silence. She was promoted after catching the Emperor's eye during the Dragon Boat Festival. Her quarters were moved. Ren was reassigned. They never saw each other again. But 2 years later, a poem surfaced in the Imperial Archive, unsigned, but written in a hand eerily similar to Ren's. She wore sorrow like a scent I could never bottle. My hands remained empty. Was it really him? No one knows. But you stand now in that same hallway, where lavender still clings to the lattice wood, and feel like someone is still waiting, still hoping to catch the edge of a memory before it slips away. And speaking of memory, did you know that eunuchs were often the best keepers of romantic timelines? They remembered who danced with whom at which festival, who wept behind which curtain, who left with red-rimmed eyes after the emperor's visit. One Qing official famously said, "A eunuch is a diary with eyes." They carried affection like ledgers never judging, only recording. And yet, despite their role in navigating the intimate lives of others, they were denied the right to build their own. There are records of eunuchs who requested to adopt children from palace orphans, only to be denied. Some created secret surrogate families among each other, carving tiny tokens of affection and hiding them under floorboards or inside the lining of their robes. A strange fringe practice emerged during the late Ming period, known quietly among eunuchs as mirror intimacy. It wasn't sexual in the conventional sense. It involved two eunuchs sitting back to back, often in silence, sometimes reciting poetry or sharing scents from lacquered boxes. The goal wasn't pleasure, but presence, a moment where you could be with someone who knew your pain without having to explain it. One carved box, found in the remnants of a burned palace wing, had a simple inscription inside. We sat. The moon was enough. You might be thinking all this sounds oddly tender, maybe even romantic. And that's the point. Romance in the palace wasn't always about power plays or seduction. Sometimes it was about survival, emotional camouflage, learning to love in ways that wouldn't get you exiled or executed. Sometimes it was a glance across a courtyard, a shared sip of jasmine tea, a brush of sleeves in a narrow corridor. And sometimes, like with Ren and Shu, it was a whole story that happened in the space between morning prayers and evening lantern light. By now, your eyes are getting heavy, but the story keeps unfolding, like a silk fan opening slowly in warm fingers. You imagine what it must have felt like for someone like Ren, standing in the cool shadow of a red pillar, knowing he could never confess, never even be sure what his feelings meant, but feeling them all the same. You imagine Shu, sitting alone with a poem she couldn't read aloud, wondering if the echo she kept hearing was her own voice or someone else's silence. And then, as you follow the sound of footsteps disappearing down the corridor, you feel it too, that peculiar sadness that comes from knowing a story is over, but never properly ended. Because in the Forbidden City, love didn't die. It simply hid itself. In fans, in poems, in pressed plum blossoms and scented ink, and in the long, long silences that stretched between glances never returned. Let's imagine you're the emperor for a night. Not the regal, stoic version carved into marble or embroidered in gold, but the real one, the one who sometimes forgets names, who gets headaches from court reports, who wonders if any of the women chosen for him actually like him. You sit on the edge of your lacquered bed, swaying slightly from too much rice wine, holding a perfumed letter written in delicate calligraphy. It's addressed to you, but you didn't write the poem it's responding to. That was your eunuch. He knows your moods better than you do. And lately he's been improving your verses, just a word here, a metaphor there. You don't mind. You like the version of yourself he puts on paper, a little more lyrical, a little less tired. But tonight, something about the letter feels off, too intimate, too direct. It's as if the reply wasn't meant for you at all. And for a moment, a thought sneaks into your royal brain. What if she's in love with him? This, right here, is the essence of the concubine conundrum, a web of curated affection spun so tightly that even the emperor couldn't always tell who was loving whom. The imperial harem, at its peak, could house over 3,000 women, each one carefully selected, cataloged, and assigned a rank based on lineage, beauty, and the ever-fluid winds of palace politics. The emperor, being just one human man with a very inhuman schedule, could only visit so many in a week. Eunuchs managed the rest. They tracked cycles, moods, illnesses, dreams. They made sure the emperor didn't accidentally sleep with the same woman twice in a row. Because yes, that could spark accusations of favoritism and throw the whole court into chaos. One eunuch's entire job was just to keep a color-coded scroll detailing which concubine had received attention and when. Think of it like a royal dating app, except instead of swiping, you had an army of castrated bureaucrats maintaining the illusion of spontaneity. But it wasn't just about logistics. Eunuchs were also the emotional regulators of the harem. They listened to complaints, wiped tears, interpreted dreams. Some even helped concubines rehearse their tone of voice for when they were finally summoned. Too eager was unseemly. Too cold was dangerous. These women weren't just competing for affection. They were vying for survival, for favor, for the chance to bear a son and secure their family's legacy. And in this silent war, the eunuchs became confidants, coaches, and sometimes co-conspirators. One of the strangest stories from the Ming Dynasty centers on a eunuch named Zhao, who became the unofficial matchmaker between an aging emperor and a concubine who had fallen out of favor. She had once been radiant, known for her singing voice and her clever jokes, but time had dulled her shine, and she hadn't seen the emperor in over a year. Desperate, she enlisted Zhao's help. He advised her to write a short poem, not flowery, but sincere. He helped edit it. Then, late one evening, he read it aloud near the emperor's quarters, pretending to rehearse a palace drama. The emperor, drunk and nostalgic, overheard it, recognized the cadence, and summoned her that very night. She was promoted within the week. Historians still argue whether Zhao acted out of duty or sympathy or something deeper. Whatever the reason, it worked, and it shows just how finely eunuchs tuned themselves to the nuances of romance that wasn't their own. In modern terms, you might think of eunuchs as the romantic ghostwriters of the Forbidden City. They knew how to polish a sigh into a sentence, how to frame longing as loyalty, and how to turn palace boredom into narrative. But unlike authors, they could never sign their work. Their fingerprints are on every scroll, every whispered confession, every flute song played under moonlight. But history rarely gives them credit, and credit, in the palace, was everything. Favor could mean new robes, better food, a quiet promotion. Losing it, that meant being forgotten, sent to clean stables or manage candle wax inventories until your name was no longer spoken. Eunuchs understood this fragile economy of attention better than anyone. They knew which concubines were rising stars, which ones were fading, and how to subtly steer the emotional winds. Sometimes a small gesture, a changed flower arrangement, a different hairpin, a delayed message was all it took to alter the entire emotional landscape of the harem. One imperial record details how a concubine was demoted simply because her eunuch spilled tea on her robe before a scheduled visit. Was it an accident, or a quiet sabotage in favor of another woman? We'll never know. But it's clear that eunuchs didn't just serve love. They managed it like accountants manage ledgers with precision. Silence, and sometimes calculated risk. And what of the emperor in all this? Was he a romantic tyrant, toying with lives like chess pieces? Or was he a prisoner too, locked into rituals and expectations that left little room for genuine connection? One could argue that he, too, was a client of the eunuch's emotional services. They tailored his moods, prepped his chambers, and gently nudged him toward interactions that would benefit the court or themselves. One particularly bold eunuch named Yu orchestrated an entire birthday surprise for a concubine the emperor had forgotten, complete with lanterns, a poem, and her favorite dish. The emperor, flattered by her joy, believed it had been his own idea. Yu was rewarded with a silver hairpin, not for his own use, of course, but to gift to another concubine he favored. The web only got thicker from there. All of this makes you realize that love in the palace wasn't personal. It was institutional, codified, measured. But within that rigid system, people still found ways to be human. A shy glance during calligraphy practice, a secretly embroidered handkerchief slipped into a laundry basket, a brief touch of fingertips as a teacup changed hands. And behind all of it, a eunuch watching, noting, sometimes hoping. You sit now in the echo of that history, beneath red-painted beams and the faint smell of peony oil, and wonder what it felt like to live a life so full of other people's intimacy, yet devoid of your own. to spend years crafting stories you could never star in, to hold space for love without ever being touched by it, and somehow to keep doing it, day after day, with grace, precision, and maybe a secret hope that someone would remember your name not as a servant, but as someone who loved without being allowed to. You know what the real danger is in a palace where no one says what they mean? A smile can kill, a glance can promote, and a wink in the wrong direction could cost you everything. You're now moving through the hall of earthly tranquility, which ironically witnessed more power plays and emotional warfare than almost any other part of the Forbidden City. It's where the Emperor's wedding night traditionally took place, and where countless concubines rehearsed years of seduction for a single chance to be remembered. But tonight, your footsteps echo beside someone else's, a eunuch named Liu. He carries a tray of scented oils, 2 brushes, and a folded note that he's pretending not to feel trembling inside his robe. Because earlier that day, a concubine named Lian had asked him for something unthinkable. A message passed to another eunuch, a rival, not out of love, but out of politics. And Liu, loyal as ever, said yes. Now, he's beginning to wonder if saying yes was the biggest mistake of his life. Let's rewind for a moment. The idea that flirtation was a game reserved only for men and concubines is a fantasy. In reality, the palace was a furnace of micro-affairs, rumor-born affections, strategic alliances, and the kind of passive-aggressive complimenting that makes modern dating look like amateur hour. Eunuchs stood at the intersection of all these moving pieces. They weren't just silent witnesses. They were mirrors, reflecting and absorbing. The psychology of this was delicate. Imagine being surrounded by beauty, by ritualized femininity, by painted faces that smile because they must, and perfume that wafts through the air like a question no one's allowed to answer. Imagine being part of that world, but never truly of it. Now imagine being the one person a concubine trusts enough to say, "He didn't look at me last night," and not be laughed at. Lian was one of the middle-ranking women, not high enough to have influence, not low enough to be invisible, just important enough to be anxious. She liked to test boundaries. She asked for stories about the Emperor's childhood. She flirted, gently, with the edge of protocol, and one day, she asked Liu if he ever got lonely. He told her eunuchs weren't allowed to feel lonely. She didn't laugh. She just said, "That sounds even lonelier." That was the beginning. From then on, she confided more, complained about her fading perfumes, wondered aloud if she'd ever leave the palace, asked about Liu's life before. He told her about his village, the color of the rice fields at dusk, how his mother used to hum while feeding chickens. She smiled, not like a woman in a palace, but like a person remembering what it feels like to be someone else. And then came the strange request. Lian wanted Liu to pass a note, not to the Emperor, but to another eunuch. Zhang. Quiet. Bookish. Assigned to the painting chamber. She claimed it was about a misplaced scroll. But the next day, she asked again. This time, Liu noticed her cheeks were flushed, not from rouge. He passed the second note, and when Zhang read it, he smiled. Slowly, like a man unwrapping a memory he didn't expect to receive. And in that moment, something shifted in Liu. Not jealousy exactly, he wasn't sure he even knew what that felt like anymore. But something darker, like the air thickening before a summer storm. Historians still argue how often eunuchs formed emotional or romantic bonds with one another. Some records are clear shared quarters, shared objects, even joint burial requests. Others are more ambiguous coded language, mutual poetry, long walks documented with unusual frequency. The truth likely lives somewhere in between. Palace life bred intimacy through confinement. When your body is no longer your own, affection can become something else entirely. A gesture, a shared silence, a carved trinket left on a pillow. Liu, until now, had never considered what he wanted. But as he watched Zhang fold Lian's letter with a kind of reverence, he felt it for the first time. A pang of recognition, of loss, of the devastating realization that while eunuchs were trained to manage other people's emotions, no one ever trained them for their own. And still, he delivered the third letter, and the fourth, and the one that wasn't folded like a scroll, but tied with a ribbon blue, the color of longing in ancient poetry. He did it because Lian asked him to, because he still hoped that doing her bidding would bring him closer. Or maybe, more truthfully, because he didn't know how to say no. He'd spent his whole life saying yes. That's what eunuchs did. And then, one day, everything changed. Lian disappeared, transferred to a different wing. Rumor said she'd been caught in an inappropriate exchange. No one knew what, exactly. But Liu knew, and so did Zhang. A week later, Zhang was reassigned to kitchen inventory, which was, in palace terms, a polite banishment. Liu He received no punishment, no thanks, just silence, which, in some ways, was worse. There's a record of a similar event, buried in the Qing court archives, where a eunuch was found to be the intermediary in a concubine's coded communications, not with another man, but with a female opera singer from outside the palace. The eunuch, unnamed, confessed to passing 27 letters, each folded into origami birds. He claimed he never opened them, never read a word. But when questioned on why he continued, he said simply, "Because when they looked at me, I didn't feel invisible." That line survives today as part of a scholar's footnote, usually quoted with academic detachment. But it lingers, because invisibility was the price of access. You got to see everything, but never be seen. And so Liu wandered the palace after Lian's departure, delivering trays, brushing scrolls, straightening ribbons on ceremonial robes. No one mentioned her name again. No one asked if he missed her. But late at night, he began leaving blue ribbons tied around stone lanterns in the garden. Not where anyone could see, just enough for the wind to find. Maybe she saw them. Maybe she didn't. That wasn't the point. The point was that he needed to do something with the part of himself that had quietly hoped, even if he didn't have a name for what he was hoping for. And you, sitting with this story now, realize that desire in the palace wasn't always about sex or romance. Sometimes it was just about being remembered, being known, having someone say, "I see you," without needing to ask for more. And sometimes, that was enough. You're staring at a lacquered screen painted with cranes flying through mist, but you know they're not flying anywhere. They're frozen mid-wing beat perfect, poised, decorative, just like everyone in this palace. Because here's the cruel truth. Even flirtation has rules. A look can raise suspicions. A compliment can start a rumor. And if you're a eunuch, caught in the delicate crossfire of palace attention, you learn very quickly that even the gentlest glance must be calculated like a chess move. Welcome to the world where casual flirtation might mean favor, or your sudden disappearance. The Forbidden City isn't just a palace. It's an entire social system wound tighter than a silk knot. Concubines aren't allowed to be bored, but they are achingly so. Eunuchs aren't allowed to be charming, but many are. So what happens when beauty meets boredom, and the only man nearby is the one who isn't really a man anymore? A glance becomes a puzzle. A joke becomes a test. A hand held a second too long becomes something that cannot be explained. There's a story from the reign of the Jiajing Emperor about a eunuch named Heng, who served in the bathing chambers. His job: assist concubines with bath preparation, lighting incense, checking the temperature of the water, placing scented oils within reach, always with eyes down, always with hands behind his back unless summoned. One concubine, Lady Shu, known for her sharp tongue and famously long eyelashes, began asking for Heng by name. Nothing overt. She claimed he had a steady hand with the combs. She said his voice was soothing. But once, as he turned to leave, she called after him. "If you weren't what you are, I'd have kept you." Everyone in the room went quiet. She smiled, and Heng, seasoned and stone-faced, merely bowed. But later that night, he vomited from nerves. Historians debate whether that comment was sincere, manipulative, or just a moment of reckless boredom. But for Heng, it changed everything. Suddenly, the other eunuchs watched him more closely. Concubines teased him with knowing glances. And the worst part, the emperor never noticed, because he didn't need to. Power doesn't need to be jealous when it knows it can destroy you with a raised eyebrow. Eunuchs existed in this strange twilight zone of attraction. Not eligible for desire, but still its frequent target. Concubines often flirted with them, not because they hoped for romance, but because it was safe. Or rather, safer. A eunuch couldn't act on it, couldn't get them pregnant, couldn't claim anything afterward. But the danger lay in the implication, because if a eunuch enjoyed the attention, that was enough to spark suspicion. And suspicion in the palace wasn't a slow burn. It was instant combustion. One palace edict from the Ming Dynasty warned eunuchs to speak with eyes lowered and hearts hollow. A poetic way of saying don't get ideas. But eunuchs were human. Ideas came anyway. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in regrets, and sometimes in the form of a single moment that, if you weren't paying attention, you might miss entirely. There's a preserved letter fragment from a concubine identified only as Lady Chen. She writes, "He never touched me. He barely looked at me. But when he handed me the comb, his fingers trembled, and I felt as though the whole world had admitted something. That's it. No names, no accusations, just a flicker of truth that somehow survived centuries of dust and silence." Of course, not every flirtation was innocent. Some eunuchs leveraged their access to gain power. A wink from the right concubine could mean a promotion, a gift of candied lotus root, perhaps a favor owed. One particularly cunning eunuch, Wu Liang, rose to prominence not through politics or military service, but through understanding which women wanted to be seen and making them feel seen. He never crossed a line, but he hovered close enough to feel its warmth. He learned their favorite poems, laughed at the right moments, remembered the names of their childhood pets, and in return, they whispered his name when the emperor asked for suggestions. He became the unofficial gatekeeper to the emperor's moods, the soft voice behind many important appointments, until one day, a rival accused him of sharing poetry with a concubine late at night. No proof, no scandal. But he was reassigned anyway. To firewood storage. That was all it took. Because sometimes, even the perception of closeness is more dangerous than actual betrayal. And yet, some eunuchs risked it anyway. Not for love, necessarily, but for the human need to feel real, to be more than a shadow. There's something devastating about knowing your life will never include certain experiences, and more devastating still when those experiences parade past you daily in swirls of silk and laughter. So when a concubine leans close and asks how her perfume smells today, and you tell her it reminds you of rain on warm stone, and she smiles in that way that's just a little too knowing you feel something. You're not supposed to, but you do. Historians still argue whether such moments were delusion or defiance. Maybe both. But the records show enough poetry, enough sighs, enough suspiciously well-maintained gifts to suggest that forbidden flirtations happened far more often than the official scrolls admit. And you, drifting now through this velvety hush of imagined history, feel the tension in every corner, the glance that lingers, the laugh that lasts half a second too long, the silence that follows, thick with what was not said. The Forbidden City wasn't a place of grand romances. It was a place of slow, aching almosts. And the eunuchs, they were the guardians of those almosts, sometimes participants, often casualties. You step into the shadow of a screen and see yourself reflected in a panel of dark wood. You're not an emperor, not a concubine, not even a eunuch. You're an observer, caught in the ache of a place where flirtation could both save and doom. And suddenly, you understand why some eunuchs scribbled poems in secret, why they learned to read faces better than words, why they took such exquisite care in arranging objects that would never belong to them. Because when you can't love out loud, you learn to love in details, in the fold of a robe, the placement of a teacup, the curve of a lantern's glow. In this world, even a sigh is strategic. And yet, sometimes, even strategy cracks under the weight of longing. There's a soft kind of power that moves differently through the palace, quieter than a decree, sharper than a sword, and infinitely more dangerous, the power of women who know exactly when to stay silent. And those women, they always had eunuchs by their side, not just as assistants or messengers, but as instruments of strategy tools in the grand chess game of palace politics. Tonight, you're not walking beside a concubine, or even an emperor. You're standing in the shadow of the most formidable player on the board, the Empress. And the eunuch by her side isn't merely a servant. He's her secret weapon. She moves like water through the corridors. Slow, deliberate, soft-footed, but impossible to ignore. Her scent precedes her something like crushed osmanthus and polished jade. Every fold of her robe is a message. Every silence is a warning. You might think she lives only for rituals and etiquette, but behind that still mask is a mind more calculating than any general. Her eunuch, whom we'll call Liang, has been with her since she arrived at court. He knows the rhythm of her voice, the pulse behind her calm. He's not just her shadow, he's her echo. And when the palace turns cold, it's often Liang who sharpens her words like needles made of silk. There's a legend, buried in the Ming court annals, about an empress who suspected one of the concubines of seducing the emperor with foreign perfumes. Not scandalous in theory, but in practice. It implied outside political influence, possibly even espionage, rather than confront the emperor or the concubine directly. The empress turned to her eunuch. Liang devised a plan as elegant as it was ruthless. He began placing subtle comments in the ears of the kitchen staff, questions about unfamiliar spices, Observations about the concubine's changing appetite. Idle remarks about her midnight walks in the southern garden. Within 2 weeks, rumors of witchcraft began to swirl. The concubine was demoted, reassigned to a colder wing of the palace. No accusations, no confrontations, just a quiet fall from grace, orchestrated by a eunuch, whose only crime was knowing how to whisper at the right volume. Historians still debate the empress's role in the incident. Some call it cruelty, others call it survival. After all, in a court where favor could evaporate with a sneeze, control was everything. And for women, control was only possible through loyalty and leverage. Eunuchs provided both. They could move between male and female spaces with ease. They could monitor, intercept, and deliver without being questioned. And when emotions ran high, jealousy, grief, hope, it was often the eunuchs who managed the fallout. But this wasn't a one-way dynamic. Empresses relied on their eunuchs, but eunuchs also saw in these powerful women a rare kind of ally. Both were liminal figures, neither fully accepted by the ruling men, both bound by rules written without their consent. And in that shared exclusion, a kind of fierce loyalty could bloom. Not always tender, sometimes strategic, but always intimate in a way few outside the palace could understand. One rare example survives in the personal writings of Empress Shu, wife to the Yongle Emperor. She kept a private journal, mostly prayers and dreams, but among the entries is a single page written after the death of her personal eunuch. Song. It reads, "He was not a man, but he was my most human companion. He never lied to me, never flattered. When I grieved, he placed oranges in the sunlight to scent the air. He said nothing. That was enough. The court never acknowledged Song's passing. No rites, no poetry. But she remembered him. And somehow, hundreds of years later, so do we. That kind of bond. Emotional, complex, unspeakable, defined many of the quiet alliances between empresses and eunuchs. It wasn't always affection. Sometimes it was cold efficiency. Sometimes manipulation. But often, it was respect. In a world where men shouted and women wept, eunuchs were the ones who whispered. Liang, our ever-loyal shadow, once prevented a civil war with a single gesture. Or so the story goes. During a particularly tense New Year's banquet, the emperor, drunk and frustrated, made a veiled insult at the empress's family. The empress remained serene, but everyone felt the shift. Tension tightened like a bowstring. That's when Liang leaned over and spilled a single cup of wine onto his own robe. The gesture was subtle, but it distracted the emperor just long enough for the next song to begin. The moment passed. The insult dissolved into wine and melody. No one ever thanked him. But the empress sent a new robe to his quarters that evening, embroidered with a tiny golden crane. A silent nod. A shared language spoken without words. The power of these eunuchs wasn't loud. It was meticulous. Consider another example managing the rivalries among the concubines. The empress couldn't afford open confrontation, so she relied on her eunuchs to observe, record, and occasionally nudge things in the right direction. A misplaced fan. A rumor that a certain consort was seen limping after a night with the emperor. A subtle reshuffling of servant schedules to ensure two rivals crossed paths in the garden. None of it provable. All of it effective. Eunuchs like Liang played the long game. They understood timing, perception, and the unbearable weight of being invisible in a place obsessed with appearances. Their reward was not always riches or titles. Sometimes it was something far more precious: proximity to power without being crushed by it. The ability to influence events without having to sign their name at the bottom. You imagine now the quiet moments after dusk, when the Empress retires to her private chambers. She doesn't speak. She sits by the brazier, warming her fingers. Liang prepares her tea rose and lychee and waits for the question she doesn't want to ask. Maybe she's wondering if the Emperor still loves her. Maybe she's deciding whether to exile another concubine. Maybe she's simply tired. And Liang, who has seen her triumph, break, and rebuild, says nothing, just pours the tea, sets it gently on the table, and adjusts the curtain so the moonlight falls exactly on the scroll she left unfinished. There is love in that gesture, not romantic, not maternal, not even platonic, but something else, something softer, sadder, and far more enduring. And so you begin to understand why the Empress's eunuch was never just a servant. He was a strategist, a confidant, a mirror that did not judge, a blade hidden in silk, and in the end, perhaps, her only honest relationship in a world built on ceremony. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from suppression, the silence of wanting something you cannot have, and never daring to name it. You feel it tonight as you follow the long shadow of a lone eunuch through a narrow corridor lined with red columns, each lacquered so finely it reflects moonlight like a mirror. His steps are careful, but not cautious. This is not a man running errands. He's stalling, delaying his return to a room that belongs to no one, filled with nothing but protocol. Because the truth is, tonight his chest is too full, and he needs the corridor to be just a little longer. This is the story of forbidden longing, the kind that curls in the corner of your throat like unsaid words and never quite disappears. We don't talk much about eunuchs falling in love. It seems inconvenient to the official narratives. History prefers its eunuchs quiet, efficient, neutered in every way. But emotions don't vanish just because organs do. They simply migrate into gestures, into patience, into poetry scribbled in margins and tucked behind wall panels, and sometimes into love. Not the kind sung in palace dramas, full of reunions and rain-soaked reunions. No, this kind of love is still, secret, and soft-spoken. It knows it cannot be fulfilled, and so it finds meaning in simply being felt. One story survives in a fragment of Ming Dynasty correspondence, scribbled in the corner of a eunuch's inventory ledger. It's just a sentence: I light her lantern every night, though she never notices the light. There's no name, no context, just a single sentence too poetic for accident. But in it lives a world, a life shaped around the presence of someone who never looked back. Maybe she was a concubine, maybe a maid, maybe just someone who once asked for her robe to be folded a certain way, and smiled when he remembered. And that smile became the axis on which his whole inner world quietly spun. It's easy to forget that eunuchs lived side by side with beauty, not the ordinary kind, but the curated, weaponized beauty of imperial concubines, hair combed into sculptures, skin powdered like porcelain, voices trained to flutter just above a whisper. And yet, for all that allure, it was never meant for them. They were the keepers, not the recipients. But proximity does strange things to the heart. The line between admiration and yearning gets thinner the longer you walk it. One look held a second too long. One song hummed in a hallway when no one else was around. And suddenly, your body, which everyone assumes is hollow, feels impossibly full. A eunuch named Min is remembered in private notes for his curious devotion to a consort known as Lady Yan. He served her for nearly 20 years, lighting incense, managing her correspondence, bringing her morning tea. Nothing inappropriate ever occurred, not even a moment. But after her death, they found in his quarters a silk pouch filled with small tokens, dried petals from her favorite peony tree, a scrap of her handwriting, and strangely, a broken comb that had once snapped in his hand while dressing her hair. Why keep it? Why wrap it so carefully? Because when you aren't allowed to love, sometimes a broken thing is the only proof you ever felt anything at all. Historians still argue whether these feelings constituted love in any traditional sense. Some say eunuchs, having been castrated before puberty, lacked the hormonal foundation for true romance. Others point to a wealth of personal writings, dream records, and temple prayers that speak not only of affection, but of longing, heartbreak, and spiritual connection. One Confucian scholar once remarked with disdain that a eunuch's love is like a river with no mouth. But maybe that's exactly why it was so powerful. Because it had nowhere to go, it deepened. There are stories, of course, that hint at actual relationships, secret and rare. One particularly poignant tale tells of two eunuchs in the late Ming period, Bao and Shen, who were assigned to opposite wings of the palace. They shared a fondness for bamboo painting and used to exchange brushwork hidden beneath official scrolls. Over time, their paintings became increasingly intimate, not in content, but in detail. One depicted a single stalk of bamboo bent under snowfall, with a tiny character tucked in the corner. The reply came a week later, on a piece of rice paper smuggled inside a box of ceremonial gloves, a lantern in a window, and the word still. Eventually, they were discovered not by scandal, but by a change in rotation. One was transferred, the other vanished from records. But their paintings, unsigned, still exist in a museum basement, misattributed to junior artists. Perhaps that's fitting. Their love was never meant to be known. But it was real. The palace did not punish eunuchs for feelings. It simply pretended those feelings were impossible. And so, eunuchs learned to live in emotional shadows, filling journals with metaphors, tending gardens with devotion that doubled as therapy. One imperial garden supervisor, a eunuch named Tang, became famous for growing moonflowers that only bloomed at night. When asked why he chose such a temperamental plant, he replied, "Because it's enough to bloom where no one sees you," whether he meant the flower or himself. No one dared ask. There's something almost monastic in the way eunuchs learned to channel longing. Denied physical love, many embraced spiritual forms. Some turned to Buddhism, others to Confucian duty. One even compiled a private manuscript titled "Prayers for Those I Serve," filled with blessings, quiet hopes, and tiny watercolored initials. It wasn't meant for publication. It wasn't even meant to be read. It was simply a record of care, proof that even the invisible needed to feel like they existed. And now you, resting here in the half-light of this slow story, start to feel the ache of these lives that loved without claiming, that found beauty in passing gestures, that knew the joy of a shared cup of tea could carry more meaning than 1,000 love letters. There's a peculiar strength in that kind of restraint, a softness that defies tragedy. And as you follow the sound of a bamboo flute echoing somewhere deep in your mind, you imagine the eunuch who carved it not for performance, but because the act of carving was the closest he'd ever come to confession. The Forbidden City was a place of rituals and punishments. But it was also a place of soft rebellions of hearts that refused to go silent, even when no one wanted to hear them. And in every quiet corner, behind every carefully folded robe, behind every lantern that flickered just a little longer than it should have, there was someone hoping, not for grand romance, not even for reciprocation, just for the chance to feel, deeply and without shame, even if only in secret. If scent had a memory, this room would reek of secrets. You step into a chamber heavy with fragrance, not the cloying perfume of concubines or the ceremonial incense of the emperor's court, but something subtler, stranger, something like sandalwood soaked in jasmine water left too long in the sun. It clings to the walls, to the curtains, to your skin. This is the scent of betrayal of perfumes used not to seduce, but to test. Because tonight, we dive into one of the most curious and quietly sensual duties of imperial eunuchs, the perfume test. Yes, you heard that right. A whole network of eunuchs trained not just in politics and etiquette, but in the art of scent detection. Because in a palace where intimacy was currency, even a whiff of the wrong fragrance at the wrong time could mean exile, disgrace, or worse. The emperor had a nose for many things, but he didn't have time to track them all. So eunuchs were enlisted not just to clean, dress, and manage, but to detect, to sniff out affairs, to verify fidelity. It sounds absurd at first, like a plot from a poorly researched costume drama. But it was very real. In several dynasties, eunuchs assigned to the inner court were trained to recognize a catalog of perfumes and bodily scents, both floral and otherwise. They could tell the difference between rose water used in the morning and the same rose water after a night of sweat and silk sheets. They were expected to recognize the faintest hint of foreign oils, especially those not issued by the palace. And most importantly, they could trace scent. If a concubine came to morning prayers wearing a perfume reserved for nighttime visits, questions would be asked. One archived manual from the Song Dynasty includes a detailed list of scent deceptions and their interpretations, supposedly written by a senior eunuch named Wen. In it, he warns that ambergris worn beneath the collar at breakfast may suggest nighttime indulgence, and that overuse of camellia oil in the hair may signal recent grooming by unfamiliar hands. Subtle. Right, this wasn't just surveillance. It was olfactory espionage. And the eunuchs were its secret agents. But how did they learn this? Not from books. They trained their noses through years of exposure. Some were blindfolded and made to identify concubines by scent alone. Others practiced by sniffing garments left in the emperor's quarters, memorizing his unique musk to later detect its presence on someone else. Their reports were never direct, always coded. A note might say, "The lady of the western wing smelled of rain and moonflower," which, depending on the season and the oils available in the palace, might mean she'd been somewhere she shouldn't. It was subtle warfare, scented with civility and soaked in suspicion. And it didn't stop at detecting perfume. Eunuchs also monitored bathing routines. If a woman bathed at an odd hour, changed her bedding too frequently, or requested new robes without clear reason, it raised red flags. One eunuch, tasked with laundry supervision, reportedly kept a private chart of which fabrics absorbed which scents most clearly. He used it to determine not just if a concubine had been with the emperor, but how recently and for how long. Historians still argue how much of this was paranoia and how much was actual practice. Some suggest the idea of scent detection was exaggerated by later dramatists. Others point to consistent references in administrative documents and personal memoirs. A Qing Dynasty memoir, written by a former concubine, includes the line, "I feared the eunuch more than the emperor. He smelled my lies before I could speak them." One particularly eerie case involved a favored consort named Mei Yu, who disappeared overnight after a eunuch reported an unfamiliar bitter oil lingering on her robe. No formal accusations were made. Her name was struck from records. The eunuch promoted to a more prestigious chamber, whether he had political motives or genuine olfactory talent. No one can say, but his nose, for that week, determined someone's entire fate. And while it sounds clinical, even cruel, there was something deeply intimate about the whole process. Imagine being the one person allowed to approach a concubine in near silence, to notice the warmth of her skin through silk, to inhale the scent at her collarbone, not for pleasure, but for evidence. Imagine her knowing it, resenting it, fearing it. That unspoken tension was everywhere. A concubine might adjust her scent to test a eunuch's reactions. A eunuch might pretend not to notice to protect her, or protect himself. The line between detection and discretion was razor thin. One eunuch, named Zhao, left behind a journal filled not with confessions, but with lists of scent combinations, emotional impressions, and a mysterious recurring note beside several names. He didn't ask, but she waited anyway. No one's quite sure what it means. A code, a memory, an acknowledgement of complicity, but it speaks to the strange position eunuchs held, silent arbiters of intimacy, guardians of a scent-based surveillance system. Few dared question, and there was beauty in it, too. Strange as that sounds, the attention to detail, the dedication to memory, the ability to associate one person's identity not with their voice or face, but the specific blend of magnolia and burnt sugar they carried on their sleeves. In a world where words could deceive and eyes could lie, scent became truth, and eunuchs were its record keepers. So now you're walking slowly through the hall of fragrant clarity, where the concubines once held their spring rituals. The air is thick with ghost smells, lotus and musk, plum wine and dust. You imagine the scene, a eunuch trailing behind a group of painted women, watching nothing, seeing everything. And you start to realize that in a world without privacy, scent was the last honest thing anyone had. You couldn't fake it. You couldn't control how long it lingered. All you could do was hope it wouldn't betray you. And maybe that's what eunuchs feared most. Too, not being seen, but being smelled. Being recognized for what they knew and could not say. Being called forward not for judgment, but for sniffing. And living every day with the knowledge that the wrong scent at the wrong time could unravel someone's entire life. So next time you think of eunuchs as silent, distant, emotionless figures in palace robes, remember this. Some of them carried the weight of the whole court in their nostrils. They knew who had touched whom, and when. They knew which scent meant loyalty, and which meant treason. And they bore it all. Quietly, scent by scent, night after night, without a single word. Imagine falling in love with someone not for their body, but for their silence, for their ability to sit beside you through an entire evening without demanding a word, for the way they arrange teacups just so, or trim a candle wick with the grace of a poet adjusting a line of verse. That's the kind of love some palace eunuchs experienced, a love not built on passion or possession, but on something quieter, deeper, more spiritual. You may think love without sex is hollow, but in the ancient Chinese court, some believed it was the only kind of love that could last. Welcome to the strange, serene world of spiritual intimacy, where desire was not denied, but transformed. Inside one of the lesser courtyards of the Forbidden City stood a small temple pavilion, rarely visited by the emperor himself, but beloved by concubines and eunuchs alike. It was called the Hall of Quiet Ink, and it housed no statues, no incense altars, just poems written in calligraphy by former residents. Love poems, loneliness poems, prayers disguised as couplets. And it was here, many believe, that eunuchs sought not just solace, but something close to sacred connection, removed from the world of lust. They found themselves drawn to the idea that love could exist in glances, in gestures, in the gentle choreography of shared existence. One eunuch, whose name has been lost to time, but whose scroll remains preserved in a dusty archive, wrote, "I do not need her hand. I need her quiet, her breathing near mine as the night folds itself in." He had served a widowed princess, long forgotten by the emperor's line of succession. She had no political power, no court duties, and rarely left her quarters. They spent years in each other's company sharing tea, feeding birds, playing Wei Qi with such dedication that a whole wall of her room was marked by ink splashes. No one ever suggested impropriety. There was no need. Whatever passed between them lived in silence, and when she died, he requested to be transferred to the temple pavilion, not to escape grief, but to be close to her echo. It wasn't romance, it wasn't friendship, it was devotion in its purest, most abstract form. Historians still argue how much of eunuch life was shaped by Buddhism, particularly Chan Zen thought, the philosophy of detachment, the embrace of impermanence, the idea that true beauty lies in stillness. These ideas resonated deeply with men who had been stripped of both lineage and lust. Many eunuchs found solace in practices of meditation, incense arranging, tea rituals, and ink brush meditation. And through these practices, a kind of eroticism emerged, not of the body, but of presence. The sensual became spiritual. The act of brewing tea with care for someone became a declaration. Lighting a lantern and placing it just so became a form of tenderness. There's even a record of one eunuch who learned to carve miniature lotuses from beeswax, not for any ritual purpose, but to place in the washing basins of a concubine known to suffer from sadness. She never asked where the flowers came from. She never asked them to stop. This intimacy is subtle, service-based, ambient, defies modern categories. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't lust. It was, in many cases, the deepest love possible between two people completely cut off from any traditional form of relationship. And it thrived precisely because it never demanded more than it could give. One court physician during the Ming Dynasty observed in his personal notes that the eunuchs carry love in their wrists, meaning, in the gentleness with which they moved, they communicated emotion more clearly than most lovers. Whether adjusting a robe, pouring a cup of wine, or brushing a woman's hair before her audience with the emperor, their touch was deliberate, reverent, and careful in a way that made many feel seen, not just looked at. Because eunuchs had nothing to gain from seduction, their affection was considered pure, and ironically, this made them more trusted than any other servant in the court. Of course, not all eunuchs were spiritual sages. Many were cynical, bitter, manipulative. Life in the Forbidden City was grueling, filled with humiliation and danger. But those who found peace in small acts of care, those who turned absence into art, left behind traces of an emotional intelligence rarely acknowledged in the grand sweep of history. One eunuch, Li Yuan, who served under Empress Xiao Zhuang, kept a diary not of politics, but of weather patterns and the moods of the Empress's dog. He noted when she laughed, when she cried, and when she simply stood at the window for hours. He never spoke of love. But when the Empress was asked once why she trusted no one but Li Yuan, she said, "Because he never asked me for anything, not even my smile." In modern terms, we might call this platonic intimacy, or perhaps emotional co-regulation. But the eunuchs of ancient China didn't have such language. What they had were actions tiny, almost invisible offerings made daily in the shadow of power. And what's most remarkable is how often these offerings were returned. Not with affection, perhaps, but with trust, with dignity, with the shared understanding that in a place where everything was monitored, measured, and manipulated, there was still a space for genuine connection. So now, as you walk slowly through the temple pavilion, you notice the layers of meaning embedded in everything. A teacup placed upside down on a scroll, not an accident, but a signal of sorrow. A dried lotus set on a windowsill, the sign of a vow unspoken. A folded robe with no perfume, perhaps the mark of mourning. These were the languages eunuchs learned to read. These were the conversations held without words. And you begin to understand why, even centuries later, scholars still puzzle over the depth of emotion encoded in their service. Because while most histories track emperors and wars, very few take the time to ask what happens when someone loves with nothing to give but presence. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of love that leaves the deepest mark. Because it doesn't fade with beauty or ambition. It doesn't vanish when bodies change. It stays, quietly, like ink staining silk, like breath in winter air, like a lantern lit every night, for someone who may never see it, but might feel its warmth anyway. There are stories that live in whispers, too fragile for scrolls, too dangerous for court records, and yet too compelling to vanish entirely. One of them floats through the corridors of the Forbidden City, like incense that never quite fades. It's called the Painted Fan Incident, and while no two versions agree entirely on the details, every version begins the same way with a eunuch, a fan, and a forbidden message passed through layers of silk and suspicion. Tonight, you walk with that eunuch, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, down the corridor where duty collided with desire, and the quiet weight of a secret nearly cracked the palace in two. The eunuch's name was Ji. Young, meticulous, quiet in that way that made him unremarkable to most, but unforgettable to the few who noticed. He served in the embroidery chambers, overseeing the delivery of fabrics and decorative items to the concubines' quarters. It was a dull position, mostly cataloging silks, arranging needles, verifying that no threads were stolen or smuggled. But one day, Ji was summoned not to the usual supply wing, but to the private quarters of Consort Lan, a woman known for her taste in poetry, her aloofness, and her mysterious absence from court gossip despite her beauty. She handed him a fan, painted, unusual, but not forbidden. The emperor often sent gifts, and a hand-painted fan with bamboo leaves or plum blossoms was a common gesture. But this one felt different. The brushwork was too deliberate, the ink too fresh. Ji bowed, took the fan, and was instructed to deliver it to the calligraphy chamber. That was all. No rush, no fuss. But something in Lan's gaze, something unreadable, unsettled him. He carried the fan under his sleeve, walking slowly. Then he paused, unfolded it, not fully, just enough to glimpse the underside of one painted leaf. And there it was, tiny, invisible unless angled just right, characters drawn in lemon juice, illegible in daylight, but revealed by heat or candlelight. G's stomach dropped. This was no art piece. It was a letter. He didn't read the whole thing. He didn't need to. Just one word stood out: leave. And that was enough to know he was holding treason in his hands. He should have turned around, reported it, seized the fan, but instead, he kept walking. Why historians still argue. Some say he was enchanted by Lan's beauty. Others believe he'd been promised a reward. But a few suspect something deeper, that G had once served the man the letter was intended for. A dismissed official. A man whose name was no longer spoken in court. A man who, some say, had written G's recommendation to the palace years ago. Was this fan his chance to repay a debt, or to correct a wrong? Or was it, as one aging record keeper phrased it, the final echo of a favor too sacred to forget? Whatever the truth, G delivered the fan, not to the calligraphy master, but to the man's grandson. Now, a minor clerk in the city records office. The letter inside was decoded. It spoke of a plan, an escape from the palace, a rendezvous with allies across the river, a bribe arranged through jade jewelry. Days passed. Nothing happened. Then Lan disappeared. Vanished. No exile, no demotion, just gone. Her name was not struck from the records, but never mentioned again. The room she once inhabited was sealed for repairs and then reassigned. G was moved to the Imperial Mint, a position usually reserved for eunuchs trusted beyond measure, which led many to believe he had not been punished. He had been rewarded, quietly, discreetly, as if the emperor himself had chosen silence over scandal. And yet, there's more. Years later, when G died, among his possessions was found a single painted fan nearly identical to the one from the incident. Same motif, same ink. But on this one, no message. Just a poem, unsigned, written in tiny characters along the edge. The wind carries only what the heart dares not speak. Was it from Lan, a copy he made to remember her, or just a symbol of the choice that defined his life? No one knows, but scholars still debate the implications. Was G part of a rebellion, or did he prevent one by delivering the fan into safer hands? Was he manipulated, or did he manipulate everyone else? What matters is this. The painted fan incident reminds us how thin the line was between affection and danger, between service and sedition. For eunuchs, every delivery could be a death sentence. Every gift might hide betrayal. And yet, they kept carrying trays, passing scrolls, delivering fans, because to hesitate was to be seen, and to be seen was to be questioned. So they became perfect performers, hiding anxiety beneath etiquette, folding panic into poise. There's another theory, less romantic but just as haunting, that G had fallen in love not with Lan, but with the act of being trusted. That in a world where he was meant to be invisible, Lan's direct gaze gave him a purpose no ritual ever had. That the fan was not a burden, but a gift, a sign that someone believed he mattered enough to be dangerous. And isn't that the most seductive thing of all? Not love, not lust, but importance. To be the axis of a story. To carry something so vital that it might change the course of lives, even if your name never appears in the official records. That was the eunuch's true temptation, not the concubine's glance, but the knowledge that his footsteps might leave marks no one would ever trace, ever. Now you stand in the corridor where G once walked, breathing the same still air. The fan is gone. The walls have been repainted, but the story lingers, folded into the silence. And as the moon casts long shadows across the tiles, you wonder how many other messages passed through these halls, undetected. How many lives changed with the turn of a wrist and a decision not to speak. The palace was full of loud voices and sharp words, but sometimes the most powerful sound was a rustle of silk, a soft breath, and the flick of a fan unfolding in the dark. There are some truths that never appear in official scrolls, not because they're false, but because they're too subtle, too inconvenient, or too human. Palace gossip, what the court called the whisper network, was one of those truths. And at the heart of this unrecorded, ever-changing constellation of rumor, hope, jealousy, and whispered revenge were the eunuchs, not just as listeners, not just as carriers, but as composers. Because in the Forbidden City, gossip wasn't idle chatter, it was currency. And eunuchs, with their access to both power and intimacy, became the brokers of stories that could tilt the axis of the court with a single sigh. You can almost hear it now, the shuffle of silk behind a closed curtain, the too casual question dropped at tea, the echo of a name spoken just a bit too loudly near a servant's ear. These were not accidents. They were rehearsed maneuvers, part of the unspoken art of emotional warfare in a palace where the right rumor at the right time could end a career or start one. And who better to seed these stories than the one person no one looked at twice? The eunuch in the corner, arranging robes, dusting scrolls, eyes lowered but ears open. One eunuch, Jian, was known for his calm demeanor and perfect memory. He never interrupted, never forgot a phrase, and never repeated anything carelessly. But that's the trick. Isn't it gossip? To be effective, must feel accidental. Jian mastered the art of the overheard correction. No, Lady Zhou wasn't in the garden last night. It was Lady Lin. At least, that's what I thought I saw. He'd say it while folding linens, casually, as though the detail didn't matter. And by the time tea was poured, the story had grown legs. Where was Lady Lin last night? Was she really wearing her garden slippers? Why did she ask for new jasmine oil? Historians still debate whether this level of influence was intentional or emergent. But the pattern appears again and again. Eunuchs placing themselves near doors, near shadows, near windows left open just enough. One tale from the Yongzheng period describes a concubine who rose rapidly in the emperor's favor, seemingly out of nowhere. Whispers credited her sudden ascent to a eunuch named Bo, who had planted a string of minor rumors about her kindness to elderly servants. Not dramatic, just soft, consistent praise. Within a month, her name came up in court poetry. Within 2, she was hosting private dinners. Bo, curiously, received a rare pine ink stick for dedicated service. Coincidence possibly, but the ink stick remains in a museum collection, marked with the words, "For the one who whispers wisely." The Whisper Network had layers, too. It wasn't all schemes and sabotage. Sometimes it was survival. When a concubine's brother was accused of treason, it was a eunuch's carefully crafted rumor about her recent prayers for the emperor's health that saved her from implication. When a young attendant was nearly dismissed for breaking protocol, another eunuch quietly reminded his superior that the boy was the grandson of a respected teacher. That memory, true or not, was enough to change his fate. There's a subtle genius to how these narratives moved. Eunuchs were masters of tone. They knew that saying, "She seems sad lately," was far more effective than accusing someone of sulking. They knew how to plant a seed of doubt without sounding accusatory. They understood that in a place where so much was rigidly controlled, emotional suggestion was often more powerful than direct command. One rarely mentioned consequence of this influence was its effect on love stories. Because in the palace, even affection could be manipulated through rumor. A eunuch might, out of loyalty, start a whisper that the emperor had spoken kindly of a concubine's singing. The next day, she's invited to perform. The day after, she's gifted a new robe. Did the emperor ever actually compliment her, Tibi? Maybe not. But now the attention is real. The trajectory has changed. And behind the curtain, the eunuch quietly smooths the hem of his sleeve and watches her pass with a slight nod. But not all gossip was gentle. Some of it burned. There's a haunting case in the Ming records of a eunuch named He, who fell out of favor after a rumor spread that he had laughed during a funeral procession. No one could say who started it. No one could prove it. But the timing was fatal. He was reassigned, then vanished. And in his absence, two rival eunuchs rose in rank, both of whom, according to one faded journal, had once served with him during a tense festival rotation. A coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the whisper network turned inward. The risk was constant. To be a eunuch was to live in the slipstream of every narrative able to steer, but never to crash without consequence. They were both witnesses and participants, never fully safe from the very storms they helped create. And some, recognizing this, began to leave coded records. Small things, symbols, a missing character in a scroll, an odd phrasing in a supply list, marks on the backs of fans. None of it conclusive. But to those who knew what to look for, it was a kind of signature. I was here. I saw. I shaped. One scroll from the late Ming Dynasty includes a curious marginal note beside a poem praising the emperor's virtue. Written in tiny characters, it says simply, "He believes what he's told." No name, no context, just a statement. But it tells you everything about how power worked. Even emperors, in the end, depended on stories. And eunuchs were the ones who spun them. Now, walking through these echoing halls, you hear them again. Not voices, but vibrations. The lingering energy of centuries of whispers, each one wrapped in care, weaponized with grace, delivered with a smile. You begin to realize that the Forbidden City didn't just run on rituals and rules. It ran on narrative, on the stories people told about themselves, and the stories others told for them. And the eunuchs. They were the secret authors of 1,000 untold histories, each more potent than a decree, more enduring than gold. Because in the end, a whisper can outlive a dynasty. It can shape how someone is remembered or forgotten. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the pen that writes what everyone else pretends not to know. If you follow the sound of falsetto drifting through the palace courtyards, you'll find yourself in the open-air theater where shadows dance, drums murmur, and voices glide like silk over water. It's here, among painted masks and candlelit performances, that you encounter a peculiar overlap of roles between eunuchs and opera boys. And what unfolds under those embroidered curtains isn't just entertainment. It's identity, desire, and illusion, all tied together with a sash. Because in the world of imperial theater, the lines between performance and reality, male and female, servant and star, were often so blurred that not even the emperor could tell who was who after the final bow. And sometimes, that was exactly the point. You wouldn't expect the Empire's most emotionally charged love stories to come from the stage, but that's where they lived exaggerated, codified, and safer than anything allowed behind palace walls. And the actors, many of them were boys trained from childhood to sing like women, move like water, and convey emotions with a single flick of a sleeve. They were adored, admired, and very often desired. Some were eunuchs, some were not, but all lived inside a performance that never really ended. Because when the makeup came off, they were still being watched, still playing roles. And sometimes, the ones watching the most closely were fellow eunuchs. One such performer, known only as Pei, captured the attention of the entire court during the reign of Emperor Qianlong. Pei was famous for his portrayal of tragic heroines, empresses betrayed, courtesans abandoned, ghosts longing for lost love. His voice, they said, could make even the coldest magistrate weep. But it wasn't just his voice. It was the way he moved, graceful, controlled, with the precision of someone who understood that every gesture had consequences. After one performance, it's recorded that the Empress herself wept silently into her sleeve. The Emperor, not known for sentiment, gifted Pei a pendant. That night, Pei disappeared from the stage for a full week. No explanation. When he returned, his voice cracked mid-performance, and he was never the same. Historians debate what happened. Some say Pei had an affair with a concubine, or with the emperor himself. Others whisper that a eunuch, who had been caring for Pei during an illness, fell in love and was punished when it was discovered. There are no records, only a series of costume notes written in a different hand after that date. More careful, more precise, almost reverent. And this is where things get complicated, because eunuchs weren't just stagehands or wardrobe keepers. Some of them trained the performers, some guarded the theaters. Others, especially those who had once been singers themselves, watched the opera boys with a mix of nostalgia and something softer. Maybe longing, maybe recognition. After all, both groups lived in the in-between, not quite men, not quite women, not quite free, not quite imprisoned. It was no coincidence that the stories on stage of forbidden love, of sacrifice, of loyalty to absent emperors mirrored the emotional lives of those who served behind the curtains. In one scroll of play scripts preserved from the 18th century, there's a handwritten note beside a tragedy titled, "The White Lotus Weeps Alone." It reads, performed by Jin, watched by Lin. We all cried, but for different reasons. Scholars believe Jin was a performer, and Lin a eunuch stationed at the theater. That note, so ordinary, so overlooked, is perhaps one of the most honest statements to survive the Forbidden City. Because that was the power of the stage, it allowed emotions to surface in a space where no one had to claim them. You could cry for the heroine and pretend it wasn't yourself you were mourning. Some eunuchs became deeply involved in the theatrical arts, not only as patrons, but as archivists. They preserved scripts, corrected stage blocking, even composed new arias under pseudonyms. A famous aria called "The Silent Petal," attributed to a court composer, is now believed by some to have been penned by a eunuch known for his obsession with plum blossoms. The aria tells of a flower that opens only at night, blooms once, and then closes forever. You don't need a degree in literature to understand what that flower represents. And then there were those who didn't write or sing, but simply watched. Eunuchs who lingered at the edge of rehearsals, who stayed after the audience had left, who cleaned the stage floor with such tenderness you'd think it was a shrine. They weren't just watching performers. They were watching possibilities, versions of themselves that had been lost, taken, or never allowed to exist. For them, the opera was more than escape. It was a mirror, and sometimes the reflection stared back a little too clearly. There's one particularly strange case buried in the personal journal of a visiting Korean diplomat. He writes of attending a spring performance at the palace, where a boy played a character disguised as a woman to protect her kingdom. After the show, a eunuch approached the diplomat and asked what he thought of the performance. When the diplomat praised the boy's skill, the eunuch simply nodded and said, "Some of us perform with paint. Some of us perform with silence." That line stayed with the diplomat for the rest of his life. He never learned the eunuch's name, but it's been quoted in modern studies of gender and performance ever since. And so you sit now, in the shadow of that candlelit stage, and you start to understand. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace. It was a theater of roles and expectations. And the ones who understood that best were the eunuchs and opera boys, those who lived every day balancing between what they were, what they appeared to be, and what they could never admit they longed for. The opera ends. The curtain falls. Applause dies out. But the story doesn't end, because off stage, in rooms filled with powder and rouge, in halls echoing with rehearsed tears and muffled laughter, the performance continues. A eunuch buttons the back of a costume. A boy adjusts his wig. Their eyes meet. Nothing is said, but the silence between them is louder than any aria. It speaks of things that never had names, and maybe never will. It begins with rose petals, soft, blushing, scattered on a polished stone floor like a lover's apology in slow motion. You're not in a bedchamber. You're in the imperial archives. And the petals aren't for pleasure. They're a warning. Because what you're about to witness isn't seduction, but revenge. Carefully measured, beautifully arranged, quiet as a poem. And behind it all, a eunuch, one who had loved too deeply, served too loyally, and finally realized that silence was not the same as safety. This is the story of a scandal that bloomed like a garden of knives, and a eunuch who used romance to make a point sharper than any blade. His name was Ruin, and he had served in the Hall of Celestial Grace for over a decade, long enough to learn every corner's echo, every sense implication, every shift in the Emperor's breath. He was quiet, competent, and invisible in the way only the most dangerous people are. For years, he served the Emperor's favorite consort, Lady Xing. He arranged her perfumes, fetched her letters, adjusted her robes before private audiences. They spoke rarely, but when they did, it was always with a mutual understanding, like two musicians playing in different rooms, but somehow keeping tempo. Over time, Ruin came to know the small things, that she twisted her sleeve when she was nervous, that she hated lotus root, that she liked her tea warm, never hot. And eventually, he knew something no one else did. She was no longer in favor. It happened slowly, like a season changing without a single dramatic storm. The Emperor's visits stopped. The gifts grew sparse. Her name faded from poetry. But worse, he replaced her with someone younger, louder, less careful. And Ruin, watching all this unfold, felt something strange growing in his chest. Not love, exactly. Not jealousy, but injustice. Because Lady Xing had never schemed, never played the harem's vicious games. She had waited, behaved, trusted the system, and the system discarded her like wilted blossoms. That was when the rose petals began. They first appeared in the emperor's private study, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor beneath the incense burner. No message, no context, just petals. The next day, in the robe chamber, they were tucked into the folds of a ceremonial sash red, with the faintest scent of Xing's old perfume. Still, no one spoke of it. By the third day, petals were found in the imperial bath, floating, pale, fragrant, unsettling. Historians still debate whether the emperor understood the message. Some believe he did and chose to ignore it. Others think he never noticed. But someone noticed. The consort who had replaced Xing did. She began asking about Ruan. Why was he still assigned to supply rotation? Why hadn't he been reassigned like the others? Why was her robe drawer always just slightly disordered, as if someone had handled it too carefully? Then came the letter, not sent, but planted folded inside the imperial records of court expenditures. A love letter, unsigned, written in Lady Xing's handwriting. Except it wasn't hers. It was Ruan's, who had spent years copying her script for scheduling purposes. The letter was mournful, not scandalous. It spoke of loyalty, of patience, of a love never returned, but always offered. It quoted a line from an ancient poem. The plum blossoms wait even when spring forgets. It didn't accuse. It didn't beg. But it lingered. And suddenly, everyone began talking about Lady Xing again. The emperor asked to see her. The new consort threw a tantrum. A robe was burned. A servant was dismissed. And ruin. He continued placing petals, always in places no one could prove he'd been. A scroll cabinet. A food tray. The bottom of a ceremonial shoe. It wasn't just a message. It was a ritual. A slow, soft rebellion, cloaked in romance. Eventually, the emperor did visit Lady Xing. Once, briefly. What was said is lost to time. But she returned from the meeting with new hairpins and a new robe. Ruan was seen in the hallway that night, kneeling, folding petals into a lacquer box, not smiling, just still. But the story doesn't end there. Weeks later, Lady Xing fell ill. Not from poison, though many whispered it, but from something internal. Worry, weariness, maybe heartbreak. She died quietly, without drama. The court sent flowers. The emperor wrote a poem. And Ruan, he vanished, not dismissed, not exiled, simply gone. His quarters were found empty, except for one thing, the box of petals. Pressed, labeled, dated, and beneath them, a final note, written not in Xing's hand, but his own. Unmasked, I was not her lover. I was her witness. That line has haunted scholars ever since, because it reframes everything. It wasn't about romance. It was about witnessing a woman treated like a symbol, then discarded when inconvenient. Ruan hadn't fallen in love. He'd fallen into empathy so deep, it became indistinguishable from devotion. And when he realized that even loyalty could not protect the innocent, he used the only weapon he had: perception. Rose petals, after all, are harmless, but they stain. And that's what makes this tale so powerful. It's not about sex or scandal. It's about quiet agency. A eunuch, denied desire, denied inheritance, denied the very shape of traditional affection, found a way to make his grief visible, to turn service into protest, to turn tenderness into resistance. And in doing so, he blurred the line between servant and storyteller. Now, as you walk through the archive corridor, you see a single petal on the floor, probably placed there by a tour guide. Or maybe not. Maybe Ruan was never found because he chose not to be. Maybe he left the palace, became a monk, wrote poetry under a false name. Or maybe, as some say in whispers, he's buried in the same garden where Xing once fed birds in the morning sun. Whatever the truth, one thing remains certain: his story survived, not in official records, but in the way people talk about petals now. Carefully, curiously, as if they might still mean something, because they do. They mean someone was paying attention. The first thing you notice about Sun Yaoting isn't his voice, though it's soft and strangely melodic. It's his eyes, watchful, sad, but with that flicker of mischief you only find in people who've spent their lives close to danger and closer to secrets. He was China's last imperial eunuch, a title that sounds ceremonial, almost mythic. But for Sun, it was painfully literal. He was the end of a line that stretched across dynasties, scandals, whispered affairs, blood-soaked politics, and endless corridors of gold and silence. His life is not ancient history. It brushed against the modern world. And through his memoirs, preserved in a voice cracking with both pride and pain, we step directly into the end of an era, where longing still lingered like dust in the folds of a discarded robe. Sun was born in 1902 in a poor village in Hebei. His family, desperate for a path into stability, made a brutal decision. They castrated him at the age of 8 in hopes of placing him in the palace. It was a gamble many families made in those final years of the Qing dynasty, hoping their sons might earn favor, food, and the rare prestige of imperial service. But Sun's surgery went badly. He almost died. The pain left him bedridden, and the shame he later wrote never fully left his body. They took everything, he said once, but not my memory, not my mind. That's the thing about Sun. He didn't just survive the palace, he remembered it, with aching precision. And what he remembered most vividly was love. Not the love he had, but the love he watched, tasted only through the air, as if the emotion itself had a scent he could recognize, but never follow. When Sun finally entered service, the empire was collapsing. The last emperor, Puyi, was a boy, still living inside the forbidden city while the outside world roared with change. Inside, however, the rituals continued. Eunuchs still polished ceremonial slippers. Concubines still observed silent breakfasts. And Sun, just a child, learned how to fold napkins with imperial precision, how to address a princess without looking her in the eye, how to make himself disappear behind doors and pillars and other people's needs. But even in these fading years, love continued to bloom awkwardly, dangerously, and often absurdly. Sun recounted, with equal parts humor and melancholy, how one concubine asked him to smuggle out letters to a former bannerman soldier she'd once known. She didn't write them in ink. She embroidered them tiny messages sewn into the hems of handkerchiefs, impossible to decipher unless you knew which stitch to tug. Sun, still too young to fully grasp the risks, delivered them faithfully, until one was intercepted. The concubine was punished lightly, because the dynasty was too fragile for scandal. But Sun, he was beaten, humiliated, and warned that another slip would cost him what little of himself he had left. He didn't cry. Not then, but decades later. He wrote, "That was the moment I knew love belonged to others. My hands could carry it, but never keep it." Still, he watched. He watched as an aging Empress Dowager stared at a jade pendant for hours, waiting for a man who would never return. He watched a junior eunuch cry after a concubine smiled at him during a festival. Just smiled. Nothing more. He saw a guard secretly leave a poem tucked beneath a lantern. He saw a princess destroy her own mirror after being told she would not be married. And through it all, Sun remained a vessel of stories. He remembered every detail. I was a ghost, he said. But I saw everything. As the years passed, the palace emptied. The Republic took hold. Puyi was expelled. The eunuchs were disbanded. Many, including Sun, tried to adjust. Some became monks, others beggars. A few died of grief, unable to function without the rituals that had given their lives shape. Sun wandered, eventually working as a street vendor, then a clerk. But the world didn't know what to do with someone like him, trained in a vanished etiquette, fluent in a lost language of robes and glances and unspoken grief. He was, as one journalist put it, a man built for a world that no longer existed. But here's the strange twist. Sun didn't disappear. He started talking, writing, telling the stories no one else could. He described, with painful honesty, what it meant to want connection while being defined entirely by the absence of it. He spoke of moments when concubines would ask him if he thought they were beautiful, and how he'd nod. Because what else could he say? He admitted to once falling in love not with a woman, but with the quiet sound of one particular princess's laugh. It made the corridors less lonely, he said, and that was enough. His memoirs are laced with that kind of intimacy, not scandalous, but piercing. He didn't name names to shame anyone. He remembered them because no one else would. The way a certain noblewoman always left the edge of her sleeve unhemmed. The way one concubine liked her rice sweet, not savory. The eunuch who sang opera under his breath while scrubbing floors. The prince who kept a mirror by his bedside but never looked into it. These were the people of Sun's world. Not emperors or generals, but ghosts of feeling. Fragments of nearly loves, trapped in a palace too big for anyone to truly be known. And maybe that's what Sun teaches us most clearly, that being near love without touching it leaves a kind of bruise that never fully heals. That witnessing desire, over and over, without being able to participate, creates a tenderness so sharp it becomes its own kind of devotion. He carried those memories like prayer beads, not bitterly, almost reverently, as if to say, I may have been forgotten, but I did not forget. Sun Yat-sen died in 1996, long after the last curtain fell on the Ming Dynasty. But his story, his voice survives, in books, in interviews, in yellowing pages where love sits side by side with loss. And you, lying there now, in the hush of history, begin to feel the strange weight of what he carried. Not sorrow exactly, but witness. He watched people love and hurt and hope in a world that didn't know how to let them speak. And then, at the end, he spoke, softly, fully, and we listened. Because some romances are not affairs. Some loves are not requited. Some histories live not in battles, but in the gentle observations of someone who was never meant to matter, but remembered everything anyway. If you believe art tells the truth only when it's allowed to, then you've never looked closely at Ming erotica. It doesn't whisper. It stares, and sometimes it smirks. Tonight, you're not in a royal archive or a courtly pavilion. You're standing in a dusty back room of a once glorious scholar's estate, poring over scrolls no one was supposed to save. They're fragile, a little faded, but still bold scenes of intimacy rendered with breathtaking precision. Curved bodies, interlocking limbs, and, more strangely, the occasional presence of someone who looks just a bit incomplete, neither man nor woman, and yet central to the composition. Yes, tonight, we wade into a world few dared document the strange, stylized, and quietly revealing appearance of eunuchs in Ming Dynasty, erotic art, and fiction. You'd expect eunuchs to be absent from sensual depictions. After all, their very purpose in the imperial system was to be neutral, sexless, voiceless, unthreatening. But Ming artists, they didn't obey rules, they exposed them. And so, tucked between lush paintings of lovers in silk bedsheets are scenes that challenge every assumption you've ever had about who was allowed to desire, or be desired. In one, a court lady reclines on a bamboo mat, her gaze locked not with a prince, but with a man holding a feather fan. His face delicate, his robe unadorned, his expression unreadable. The caption, "The one who knows where to look." Historians aren't sure what to make of these inclusions. Some say they're metaphors, eunuchs representing forbidden desire, the invisible witness, the unspeakable yearning. Others argue that these images reflect lived realities, that some palace women formed emotional or even physical bonds with eunuchs, and that artists, always a little mischievous, painted what the court dared not admit. Whatever the intent, these figures appear more often than anyone wants to say, tucked in the margins, folded into the backgrounds, sometimes staring directly at the viewer, as if to say, "You know I was here." One of the most studied pieces in this genre, it is an anonymous scroll known as The 10 Joys of the Moon Chamber. It's a visual narrative, 10 linked scenes of intimacy, some playful, some deeply symbolic. But in scene 5, something shifts. A eunuch stands in the doorway, not participating, not intruding, just watching. His eyes are lowered, but he's there. And unlike the other background figures, maids, servants, musicians, he's painted in equal detail. His presence is not accidental, it's thematic. And the placement, right at the midpoint, as if the artist wanted to remind you this story has more than 2 sides. There's a scholarly theory, grounded in the work of Michel Foucault, that surveillance itself becomes erotic in highly controlled environments. When privacy is a luxury and silence is mandatory, being observed, truly seen, takes on an electric charge. Eunuchs, always present but rarely acknowledged, became both the facilitators and the ghosts of desire. And some Ming fiction leans into this idea with surprising boldness. Take, for instance, the novella Jade Mirror in the Perfumed Hall, which tells the story of a concubine named Li Shu and her complicated relationship with a eunuch attendant, Fan. The tale doesn't center on seduction, but on observation. Fan becomes the keeper of her routines, her frustrations, her poetry. At first, she resents him. Then, gradually, she depends on him not for intimacy, but for recognition. In one passage, she writes, "I do not miss a man's hand. I miss the sound of someone listening when I say I feel forgotten." Eventually, she disappears, possibly dismissed, possibly dead. The final lines of the novella show Fan arranging her hairpins in the shape of a plum blossom on her old dressing table. The eroticism here isn't physical, it's emotional, and yet it resonates more than any of the story's more explicit scenes. Some versions of this tale were illustrated, albeit discreetly. One rare edition shows a single panel, the eunuch holding her silk robe, eyes closed. Not lewd, not tragic, just still. That image has puzzled art historians for decades. Why include him? Why give him the closing gesture in a story ostensibly about female passion? The answer, perhaps, lies in who was reading these books. Not just men seeking titillation, but women trapped in rigid roles. and servants who saw themselves nowhere in official records. For them, these images weren't just fantasy, they were reflection. It's also worth noting that some eunuchs themselves became collectors and even producers of this kind of literature. While officially taboo, erotic scrolls circulated through private channels, and several known eunuch estates, upon inspection after death, revealed carefully preserved libraries, not just pornographic content, but layered, literate stories about longing, rituals, dreams. The presence of these collections wasn't scandalous. It was expected. Who else but eunuchs, surrounded daily by the sensuality they were forbidden to touch, would crave understanding of its shape? One eunuch, identified in his posthumous inventory only as Tao of the Plum Garden, had annotated margins of several erotic texts with quiet, cryptic remarks. Next to a scene of a woman removing her robe, he'd written, "I knew one who always sighed before lifting her sleeve," near a passage describing a kiss. Not all mouths taste of longing. Were these memories observations? Longing in disguise? No one knows. But the intimacy of the notes, their tenderness, haunts every scholar who reads them. Because even if Tao never touched another body in his life, he clearly touched the edges of someone's emotion. And maybe that was enough. The real surprise, though, comes in the form of parody. Some erotic stories written in the later Ming years feature eunuchs as comedic figures bumbling, mistaken for women, or treated as convenient plot devices to deliver lovers' notes. On the surface, it feels cruel. But dig deeper, and you find something else: subversion. These eunuchs often outsmart the nobles. They overhear secrets. They save the day. They are, despite the mockery, central. And by placing them in the middle of romantic farces, authors were acknowledging something few dared admit. Outright eunuchs were part of the erotic landscape of palace life. Not as lovers, perhaps, but as interpreters, witnesses, ghosts with keys to every door. And you, standing now in the imagined gallery of these quiet images, begin to feel the weight of all this visibility. Not grotesque, not perverse, just human, rendered in brushstrokes so delicate they ache. These were lives lived at the edge of desire, painted with more nuance than any history book ever dared offer. So next time you think of eunuchs as footnotes, figures of pity or curiosity, remember this in the art of the Ming. They were present, not hidden, not ashamed. Present in the places where longing was traced most carefully. And maybe that's what art has always been, for not to flatter power, but to tell the truth in images soft enough to survive. Deep within the silent wings of the Forbidden City, there's a corridor bathed in moonlight and dust, a corridor where grief isn't mourned, but paused. And tonight, as you tread its echoing tiles, you realize you're not alone. Ghosts linger here, not ethereal phantoms, but memories of eunuchs who waited, watched, loved, and died without ever speaking their truth. Here, amidst jade pillars and faded lacquer, their whispers form a chorus. The gusting wind through lattice windows carries the tremor of their unspent longing. And in the hush, you feel a presence just behind you, Sattva, observant, impossible to see. These are the ghosts who still wait. They wait for recognition, for stories to be told, for voices to carry their love beyond palace walls. Tonight, you become part of their audience, an unseen guest in a realm where history didn't bother to look. Their tales are hidden in cracks between seats, sewn into banners, brushed into margin notes of forgotten scrolls. Some died quietly of old age, Others vanished in purges nobody wrote about. But all left something behind, a smile carved in wood, a pressed flower wedged in a book, a poem unfinished. Consider the eunuch called Jin, who served in the East Study under Emperor Kangxi. He never rose to great power, but he collected orchids fragile, ephemeral blooms he cherished for their quiet persistence. When he died, his quarters were found filled with wilted blossoms arranged in small porcelain cups. No explanation, no note, just petals and emptiness. Scholars speculate he was in love with a concubine's laughter, or perhaps with her patience. We may never know. But when you walk down that corridor tonight, you might sense the slow ache of all those orchids, petal by petal, folded into memory. Or think of the story about Wei, who carved the names of absent loved ones into the back of a lacquered screen. When the screen was repaired during renovation, the names were scrubbed off, erased for cleanliness. They said. But later, someone found faint traces beneath the paint, a child's name, a concubine's nickname, a brother's laugh that no longer echoed. They repainted over it. The screen returned. But beneath its shiny surface, the ghosts remain buried. Yes, but not gone. Historians still argue whether these acts were rebellion or survival. But to you, lying here, they feel like prayers. And maybe they were. Messages to the unborn, to the living, to the idea that someone saw, that someone remembered. There's a legend mostly dismissed by scholars about a eunuch who carved his own epitaph on a hidden stone. It read, "He who gave voice to those who could not speak." No name, no dates, just that line. And when the stone was discovered, officials argued about removing it. It was subversive. A eunuch, remembering eunuchs. But they didn't remove it. They couldn't, because it was also beautiful, haunting, human. Now, centuries later, you stand where they fell silent. And you realize that silence wasn't absence. It was accumulation. The sense that 1,000 small things petals, poems, ornaments, screen carvings added up to something larger than any decree. A history lived in margins and afterthoughts, in the breath between ceremonies and the whisper before dawn. Maybe you feel a chill, or maybe warmth. The corridor is both cold and alive. It hums softly with presence. And as you step forward, you swear you hear the faintest scrape of a brush over silk, the sound of someone painting letters no one would read until centuries later. You emerge into the courtyard beyond, where moonlight pools over carved stone lions. The air is still. The ghosts are still. And in that stillness, you feel their gift stories not shouted from banners, but folded quietly into corners. Stories that knew they might never be seen, and loved anyway. Walk home tonight with that memory. A eunuch's ghost might not hold your hand, but it wants you to remember, to carry its story gently. Because history isn't just battles and kings. It's also the silent steps of those who served, watched, and loved in a world that forgot to listen. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over the palace roof, those ghosts will still be there. But maybe for the first time they'll feel seen. It begins, as it often does, with a lock of hair, wrapped in red thread, folded inside a faded silk pouch, tucked at the bottom of an old lacquered chest in a side room. No one visits anymore. You almost miss it, just another curiosity among ceremonial scrolls and incense sticks. But as you untie the thread, something changes. The air thickens. The scent of aged sandalwood sharpens. And you realize what you're holding isn't decoration. It's remembrance. a keepsake from a eunuch whose name never made it into any official record. But here, in your hand, is proof that he loved someone enough to keep a piece of them forever. Not for power, not for blackmail, but simply to remember. What follows is the slow unspooling of everything that's been hinted at across these corridors and silk pages, everything whispered in footnotes, buried in margins, hidden in petal offerings. Because now, in this final chamber of the palace, you're face to face with the truth everyone pretended not to see, that eunuchs, though disfigured by design, were among the most emotionally alive beings in the empire. That they did not live without love. They simply loved differently, with more restraint, more creativity, more desperation. Among the collection in this room lies a calligraphy scroll, unsigned, but marked with a familiar watermark traced back to the wardrobe division. The text reads like a love letter, but it's written entirely in metaphors of court attire. I await the weight of your winter collar, it says. Even my sleeve remembers your hand. Below, in smaller characters, is a single phrase we never touched, but I am ruined anyway. Some believe it was written by a eunuch who had served a scholar official for years, styling his robes, folding his collars, learning his moods. When that official married, the eunuch was reassigned. Nothing else was recorded. Only this letter remained, left hidden behind a folding screen. These final records are full of this kind of almost love. An anonymous poem tucked inside a silver snuff box. Even with no body, I still ache. A painted fan with only one half of a couple depicted, the other half left blank. A spoon carved with initials, then filed smooth again. You start to see a pattern, a need to hold on to intimacy, even when the world offered no frame for it. And in that ache, you recognize something heartbreakingly familiar. Not just from the past, but from now. Because what were these eunuchs if not mirrors of our own secret longings? They lived without the freedoms we take for granted, yet still found ways to love, to witness, to preserve meaning. They transformed absence into art, restraint into legacy. And somehow, through all the cruelty and dismissal, they kept their hearts intact, broken. Perhaps, but never numb. Even Michel Foucault, in his sprawling studies on sexuality and power, might have smiled at this chamber. Here lies the proof that where power suppresses the body, the soul rebels in poetry. And sometimes, the most censored lives produce the most intimate truth. One last relic sits at the center of the room, a jade comb. It's worn, not finely carved. A servant's comb, not a lady's. But underneath the spine, barely visible, is a tiny inscription used to untangle her hair. Never mine. That line doesn't ask for pity. It doesn't accuse. It simply testifies. Someone remembered a moment, cherished it, etched it in jade, not because it was grand, but because it was real. And maybe that's the lesson these final artifacts leave you with, not to chase after forbidden romances or grand tragic love, but to notice the quiet devotion that exists in plain sight. The eunuch who memorized a concubine's favorite lullaby, even though he'd never sing it aloud. The one who rewrote her letters with cleaner phrasing so she wouldn't sound desperate. The one who, knowing he would never be loved, still poured tea with both hands, just in case someone needed to feel important that morning. They were not saints. They could be petty, political, even cruel, but within the system that crushed them, they found ways to be human, sometimes more human than anyone else. As the lamplight flickers and your breath slows, you return the lock of hair to its pouch. You feel like you've stumbled upon something sacred, not religious, but sacred in the way memory can be when it's been so carefully preserved against erasure. The chamber darkens. The stories settle. The ghosts return to their shelves. And you, finally, are ready to sleep. Let your body soften now. Let the voices of the palace fade gently into the background. The rustle of silk. The soft steps on stone. The distant hush of court music carried by the wind. The eunuchs who walked these halls, who waited through lifetimes for a moment of recognition, are quiet now, not silenced, just resting. Their stories no longer linger as unanswered questions, but as gentle rhythms beneath your breath. You've walked their corridors, glimpsed their longing, traced their sorrow in rose petals and jade combs. You've seen how love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it kneels, it observes, it survives in the smallest gestures, a sleeve folded just so, a fan placed at the right angle, a name remembered in silence. With every breath, let your thoughts grow lighter. Let the tapestry of history stretch out, smooth and vast, beneath you. You are held here not by walls or rituals, but by memory, by empathy, by all the stories too quiet for textbooks, too fragile for monuments, yet strong enough to reach you now, across centuries. You don't need to carry them all, just one name, one sigh, one lock of hair. As your eyes drift closed, imagine the stars rising over the forbidden city. No fanfare, no trumpets, just a sky full of quiet witnesses, just like you. End of script. Sweet dreams.